All right, and get a thumbs up that we're seeing the presentation. Looks like it's working here. All right, very good. The scope of the presentation is an introduction to VHF contesting for HF contesters, people who are already familiar with contesting in general. So I'm not going to go over things like how to actually operate, the difference between running an S&P and that sort of thing. I'm going to assume that everyone is already familiar with all of those concepts. I'll talk a little bit about about VHF contesting in general, give you an idea of which contests are out there, when they are, talk a little bit about categories, strategies, and then go to
prison. They need to be there serve their time.
And then go into a little bit more detail on QRP portable and rover operations. And we'll talk a little bit about the June VHF contest specifically, since that's coming up this weekend. Okay, so first question is VHF contesting right for me? If you've never operated a VHF contest before, it may not be for you if you get bored when your rate meter drops below 150. Let's face it, rates are slower on VHF for a variety of reasons. So if you only are excited by contesting when you can immediately command a large pileup on HF, then you're probably going to be bored with VHF contesting. If you don't want to try anything new and want to keep operating the same contest you've always operated, then you're probably not going to be interested in VHF contesting. If you're looking to make progress on DXCC, 5-band DXCC challenge, honor roll, none of my all-time new ones are on 6 meters or above, so that's probably not going to do it for you either. However, if you enjoy trying new things, if you like making those, quote, impossible contacts or really unusual contacts, if you are technically oriented and enjoy a good technical challenge, if you don't want to put in, if you don't want to go to the trouble of putting up large HF arrays, that's for various reasons, a lot of people can't do that. You can be competitive with small antennas with VHF contesting, and if you are interested in the VUCC awards, those are all good reasons to get into VHF contesting. So hopefully more of you fall into the latter category than the former, but just being upfront about it. So some differences between HF and VHF contesting. So VHF contesting is very grid square oriented, and I'm going to assume that everyone, one way or another, is very familiar with grid squares at this point. With digital exploding the way that it has, I think everyone's fairly familiar with grid squares. The grid squares are multipliers in most contests, except for the ones that use distance-based scoring. Two of the most prominent contests that use distance-based scoring are the 222 and up distance contest in August, the ARRL 222 and up contest, and the microwave sprints that are held in May and in October, sponsored by the Central States VHF Society and the Southeastern VHF Society, respectively. I'll mention that again here in a few minutes. The distance-based scoring is really interesting because it helps level the playing field. One of the complaints about VHF contesting over the years has been certain parts of the country, namely the Northeast, are so densely populated with VHF operators that the stations up there can get on and just work nothing but locals for 30 hours on all of the bands and beat everybody. Distance-based scoring helps level that playing field somewhat. With VHF contesting, you also have the concept of rover operations. Mobile operations are allowed in very, very few HF contests outside of state QSO parties and field day. With VHF contesting, rover operation is not just allowed, but it's encouraged, and it provides an opportunity for others to work rare grids that don't have much native activity, and it also provides you the opportunity to go be the rare station, to be on the other end of the pileups, and that's really exciting. This is key, and this is going to come up several more times in the presentation tonight. The rules regarding assistance are much more permissive on VHF, and coordination using non-amateur means is actually a really key part of VHF contesting. More on that later. And as I've mentioned before, again, totally upfront disclaimer, rates are going to be lower than on VHF than they are on HF. Propagation is a major factor on 6 meters. Sporadic E is king. On 2 meters and up, tropo will make the difference between working only locals and working more stations farther away. All right, so now I'll address the elephant in the room. And we were actually talking a little bit about it before the meeting began this evening, and that is digital. There's been much said about digital. There are many opinions about digital, but I'll give you my perspective on digital. So first things first, if you're not familiar with VHF contest rules, all modes are treated as somewhat equivalent. So it's one contact per band with another station, regardless of mode, which means it counts the same to work someone on CW as it does FM, as it does FT8, as it does MSK 144. So it's there's no incentive to use any one mode over another other than which mode best gets the job done for a particular situation. Digital has been allowed for years prior to FT8's inception. That was in 2017. Seems like it was just yesterday, but it's been 5 years now. FT8, of course, even though digital's been allowed for a long time, FT8 has driven most of the activity in recent years. There's also a good bit of FT4. I wish there was more FT4. And MSK 144 for meteor scatter. And I would say that now in the southeastern United States, on the VHF bands, as far as weak signal work goes, the majority of the activity is now on digital. And that's not to say that there's not any analog activity. There certainly is. There are still a number of nets out there that are on single sideband. There are ops who do FM only, but the majority, and this is it's personal opinion, I don't have the numbers to back it up, but in my experience, the majority of the activity is now on digital. And this is something else, yet again, that levels the playing field for us here in the Southeast. Our terrain is not favorable always for VHF, UHF. It's much hillier. You don't have the situation in the Midwest where you can see for miles from anywhere. You don't have the situation in the Northeast where there are just operators everywhere. There are fewer operators here. We're spaced farther apart. People are surrounded by hills in some instances. Digital helps bridge that gap somewhat between operators in the Southeast. And digital has been utilized for years for meteor scatter. That's really not new. The one advantage that analog does have is that you do get better rates with analog when the band is open to a populated area. So there are some qualifiers there. When 6 meters is open to the Northeast, absolutely run phone and CW for all it's worth. Although, to be perfectly honest, on 6 meters, almost all of the CW activity has migrated to digital. I used to operate 6 meter CW in the summers for hours on end working stations, and I noticed by 2015, 2016, my rates for general operation were slowing way down, and finally realized everyone had gone to JT65. Now that's all on FT8. But again, you have to kind of keep an eye on band conditions when you start seeing loud signals all over the waterfall and they're all coming from a populated area. Then it absolutely makes sense to give analog a try. There are now category, I don't guess they're technically overlays, I guess they're separate categories in the June VHF contest for analog only for single ops. So if you are completely opposed to digital, and I know there are people out there who are for various reasons, you now have an opportunity to compete. You don't have to compete against the stations running digital anymore if you don't want to. Couple of myths to dispel. You don't have to live on a mountaintop to be competitive in a VHF contest. It helps, certainly. but it's not a strict requirement. For 6-meter sporadic E, the terrain really doesn't matter a whole lot. Again, it helps, but it's not a deal breaker. And as I said, with FT8, with digital, with the lower signal to noise ratios needed to complete a digital contact, it's made some really amazing things possible from very average locations on 2 meters and up. So don't let a other than traditional VHF location hold you back from VHF contesting. You also don't need stacks of beams and towers for each band and legal limit amplifiers and all of the other big gun accessories to be competitive. There are a number of categories with different power limits, different numbers of bands that you're allowed to operate. There are many ways to be competitive in VHF contest, even with just FM gear. So the VHF contest calendar looks like this. The ARRL sponsors 4 major VHF contests a year. There's January, June, and September, and the aforementioned 222 and up distance contest. June, of course, is coming up this weekend. September, VHS, the second full weekend of September. January tends to move around a bit. It's either the third or fourth weekend, and you kind of have to just watch for that date each year. There's also another major contest coming up next month, the CQ Worldwide VHF contest, that is 6 and 2 meters only. So that's an opportunity if you are really focused on 6 meters, mostly interested in 6 meters. That contest is an opportunity to focus on 6 or 2. You can actually do a single band 6 meter entry, a single band 2 meter entry, or both in that contest. There are also the sprints. They're 6 meter, 2 meter, 222, 432, and microwave. Those are run twice a year. The spring sprints are run by the Central States VHF Society in April and May. The Southeastern VHF Society runs the fall sprints. The 6 meter sprint is in August, actually still in the summer, so that there's a chance of sporadic E, although by the second week of August, it's getting really iffy at that point. And then the rest of the sprints are in September and October. Those are 4 hours each. The microwave sprints, which is defined as 902 megahertz and up, last 6 hours each. And those provide a really good opportunity if you're getting started in VHF contesting to build gear for one band at a time, test it out in a short little contest. It's great practice. And I rove in all of those, which roving in a 4-hour contest is an interesting experience. There are also some non-contest days of interest for VHFers. There are some regular activity days that we have in the Southeast. The first Saturday of the month, we have a 222 and up activity day. It's a very informal activity. Folks go out to mountaintops and do some testing and work each other. This is a little bit out of the range of, I think, most of the SECC members, but the SLAMS group, St. Louis Area Microwave Society, they have a 1296 and up, a microwave activity day, also on the first Saturday of the month. So point being, there's, even on non-contest first Saturdays of each month, there is an opportunity to do a lot of VHF weak signal work and testing and getting ready for the contests. And this is something that I think has kind of been lost over the years. These were proposed by the ARRL a number of years ago, and I think they have been implemented partially in some places, and in others they've been totally forgotten about. And I've been on a somewhat of a mission to try to fix that. The ARRL a number of years ago proposed activity nights, and each band would have an activity night on a different night of the week. And the sprints that I mentioned before actually fall on these nights, except for microwave and 6 meters. But the 2 meter sprint's always on a Monday night, the 222 on Tuesday, and the 432 on Wednesday. So that's a bit of a vestige of these. But if you had a bunch of folks who were wanting to get on these bands, this would be a great activity to start up in local areas to promote more activity. Just a few words about equipment. Most of us now have HF rigs that have 6 meters built in, so you already have the radio that you need. at least to get started in VHF contesting. All mode radios for 2 meters and up are a little bit harder to come by. I know the ICOM 9700 has been a very popular radio, and for good reason. I really like mine. And there are a number of older rigs out there that are becoming much more affordable now that the 9700 has been out for a while. So it's a lot easier to come by VHF weak signal gear than it once was. It's more affordable. And as I've mentioned a couple of times, even if all you have is FM on 2 meters and up, you might be surprised at what you can work. We'll talk a little bit about FM only a little bit later. So when you think about commercially available gear, you think about, of course, 6 meters. The ICOM 9700 is a 2 meter 432 and 1296 radio. So equipment for those 4 bands, fairly easy to come by. But the other bands generally require a different approach. And that approach is that of the transverter. So the transverter is a transceiver converter, is where the word comes from. And it is the most common way that people get on 222, 902, 2304, and all of the microwave bands above that. There are some inexpensive and not so inexpensive options for getting into those bands. Until recently, with recent events, there were some transverters available on eBay sold by a Ukrainian amateur. The eBay store was called Transverters-Store, and he sold many 222 transverters for about $100 each. And they do work. They're not necessarily the best transverters on the market, but they're very viable for making QSOs. They've made a lot of contacts, and I've worked a number of them. So there are some still on eBay from a different seller. It's a different design, and I don't know that much about those, but that is one option to look for. There's also a seller in Bulgaria called SG Lab that makes 902, 1296, 2304, and 3400 transverters. I have the 902 and 2304 and just ordered the 1296 amplifier from him. And I've yet to evaluate those, but from what I've heard so far, they're decent from others who have used them. They run about $200 to $250 a piece. And then the gold standard in the US, Q5 signal for the bands below 2304 and Down East microwave for 2304 and above. There's also the Kuhn transverters from Germany for some of the microwave bands that are highly regarded. But point being, this is where that technical expertise comes in that I mentioned before. This is where you get an opportunity to do a little experimenting, a little building to get on some of these bands, and it's very rewarding. I don't know how many of you have ever made a QSO on 222 weak signal, CW or phone or digital, or 902 or 1296 or 2304, but it's very rewarding no matter how long you've been a ham to do something for the first time. It's like making your first QSO all over again. Antennas, some options for antennas if you want to go the build your own route. The WA5 VJB cheap Yagi design served me well as a QRP portable operator and cost just a few dollars each to make and are not difficult to make. If you want something a little more robust, a little more permanent, I recommend Directive Systems for their K1FO style Yagi antennas. They also make a series of Rover antennas, Rover Yagis, based on the K1FO design that break down into a size that can be transported in a car. So there are certainly other good manufacturers out there, M Squared. There's some sellers in Europe now that are selling loop-fed arrays. So those are just some ideas of antennas to get started. And of course, with 6 meters, if you have an HF radio with 6 meters and an auto tuner, you can load up just about anything and make some noise on 6 meters. So don't let the lack of an antenna stop you from getting on VHF. And I'm including here internet access. It almost is a requirement, especially if you're going to do any work at 222 and up. Coordination really is key over the internet. So the next step, if you're wanting to get into VHF contesting, is to choose a category. So for fixed stations, there are single op and multi-op categories. The single op breaks down into several options: low power, high power, single op 3-band. The 3 bands are 6 meters, 2 meters, and 432, and the power limits are a little more restrictive in that category. That really caters to the ham with one of the all mode radios that has 6.2 and 432, like the ICOM 706 Mark IIG, 7000, 7100, et cetera, et cetera. And then FM only, which is also limited to 4 bands, the lowest 4 bands. And as I mentioned, there's now an analog only overlay for single op low power, single op high power, and single op 3-band. Multi-operator, there's limited and unlimited. Limited means that you can only count for points any 4 bands. That is different from limited rover, and I was in an email thread about limited multi-op a while back, and I would have sworn that the rules were the same for limited multi-op as they were for limited rover, that you had to use the lowest 4 bands, but no, it's any 4 bands. So it could be 6.2, 432, and 1296, as opposed to having to be 6.2, 222, and 432. And then for portable rover, there's the single op portable category, or single op QRP portable. That is the only QRP category in the ARRL contests. And then the 3 rover categories: limited rover, classic rover, unlimited rover, and I'll explain all those when we get to that section of the presentation. A few strategies about mode selection. I think I've covered a lot of this already in the discussion about digital. Even if you mainly intend to use digital, do check analog occasionally. Check the calling frequencies: 144.200, 146.52, the phone segment of 6 meters. Because there will be, and possibly more, this contest with the new categories, some operators who are analog only, and if you spend all of your time on digital, you'll miss them. And there are certainly opportunities for good rates on sideband, on 6 meters especially. If you live in a highly populated area, if you live near Atlanta, Chattanooga, possibly some other places, give a shout occasionally on 146.52 simplex. In this year's 2 meter sprint, I operated from a couple of hilltops near Chattanooga, and I just, for grins, went over to 146.52 and said, "This is NV4B rover and Echo Mike 74 or 75, and operating the 2 meter sprint as anybody around." And actually, from one location, worked about 4 or 5 people in just a few minutes on 5.2 simplex. So don't rule out 2 meter FM. If you operate digital, and I think this is something probably if you operated the International Digital Contest this past weekend, you may have seen a bit of. Don't call CQ continuously. It's easy to do compared to the analog modes. You just keep clicking buttons and call CQ over and over and over and over. If you do on digital, you're missing half of the activity on the band, and you're probably missing multipliers, you're missing stations. So come up for air from time to time. If you operate FT8 or FT4, take a break, see who's on the same sequence as you, and you might find somebody you really want to work. And when 6 meters gets really busy, when the FT8 waterfall gets crowded and you see a lot of dark red signals in the waterfall, switch over to FT4. It doesn't require that much more of a signal to noise ratio, and it's twice as fast. So, and it's usually never quite as crowded as FT8, but you can still work a decent rate with it. So don't forget about FT4 on 50.318 on 6 meters. If you see rovers, this is kind of my mantra if you read my 3830 posts. If you see rovers, call rovers. If I'm in motion and I'm operating digital, I pretty much have to run. It's really difficult on my tablet to, with my fingertip while I'm driving down the highway at miles per hour, to try to pick out a specific station and double click with my finger on that tablet, because almost always what happens is I end up calling someone else. So it's very difficult for me to call you if all you do is call CQ, if you see somebody with that /R call sign, give them a call. They'll really appreciate it, because more than likely, if they're operating digital in motion, they're not going to be able to call you. And again, going back to the conversation we had to begin with, make sure you're using NA VHF contest mode. If you're operating the 222 and up distance contest, or one of the other contests that does a 6-character grid exchange, EU VHF contest mode will accommodate that. Also sends a signal report and a serial number, but you can, of course, ignore that. So now on to coordination. So this is one of the big differences between HF contesting and VHF contesting. And at first, it may seem a little bit like cheating, and it can be cheating if you break the rules, of course. But there was a time when I was a little bit disillusioned by the direction of VHF contesting, and I felt that it was turning into a cell phone contest more than it was a VHF contest. But the reality is that, especially at 222 and up, with the narrow beam width of antennas, the inability of some stations to operate a lot of different bands simultaneously because they're having to switch, they just have one radio for a number of bands, it really becomes important to have a way to get in touch with somebody and say, hey, point toward whatever grid I'm in, my 6-character grid. And that has probably done more to increase my score in the past year, learning how to leverage the various tools for coordination and getting a good computer in the rover that I could turn on my Wi-Fi hotspot and have multiple browser tabs open to go between different coordination mediums. That's made a big difference, especially in September. The rules vary from sponsor to sponsor. CQ is much more restrictive in what you can do. I don't think you can solicit other stations directly in the CQ contests, or the CQ VHF contest. The sprints are also a little bit more restrictive, but the ARRL rules I provided on the slide, and I'm not going to read them word for word, but basically you can do just about anything other than say, I got your EM83, did you get my EM61? You can't convey exchange information out of band, obviously, or you can't say, I got, keep going, or you can't say, I need you to repeat something, I didn't get it. Those sorts of things are off limits. If you don't complete, you start over to be within the contest rules. Before the contest, if you're new to VHF contesting and don't have a lot of contacts, get in touch with some of the VHF contesters in your area, and a great way to do that is to look at previous contest results on the ARRL score database, the results article, CQ results articles and such, 3830. Find out who the active VHF contesters are in your area, reach out to them via email, let them know you're interested, and try to exchange cell phone numbers or find out what tools they use for coordination. The main tools that I use, online tools, the one that is my favorite that is still relatively new, it's been around for about 3 years now and is still growing, is Slack. There is a VHF chat on Slack, vhf-chat.slack.com, with a number of different rooms, number of different channels. There's channels for rover coordination, for meteor scatter, and then some regional rooms. And there is one for the Forelanders. I assume everyone in the SECC is familiar with Forelanders. However, Forelanders is not restricted only to members of Forelanders. It is a group really for all of the Southeast, and as you'll find when you join it, it's just about the most active regional channel on Slack, on VHF chat, and people join in from all over the country. So it's a popular channel. You do have to have an invitation, and if you Google around, You can find that. I'm not going to provide it here because it does tend to change from time to time, but it's not terribly difficult to find. ON4KST is an older online chat room. It's been around for a number of years. It tends to mainly be used by the folks in the Midwest and the Northeast. There are chat rooms for the different bands and different ITU regions. W4DEX is one that's a little bit more local to us. It's mostly the Atlantic coasts of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Virginia, those areas, mainly the areas covered by the, I think it's the East Coast 70 centimeter net is the name of it. But there are folks who hang out there who don't hang out on any of the other chat rooms. So there are opportunities for contacts there. And then Ping Jockey is a long-time meteor scatter coordination website. It's fairly antiquated by modern standards. There's been a push to move folks over to Slack. Slack is a lot more feature-rich and easier to use, but there are a number of folks who are still only on Ping Jockey. So if you intend to operate meteor scatter, and as an aside, meteor scatter is beyond the scope of this presentation, but I will mention it again later on, but that would be the place to go if you're going to operate meteor scatter. A few words about strategy for June. First thing you should do when operating any contest for the first time or any contest you haven't operated recently is to review the rules. Again, as I've mentioned, there are some rules that are quite different from HF contests, so start with the rules. The June VHF contest is right in the heart of sporadic E season. Sporadic E season tends to run from about May to August in the Northern Hemisphere, and June is right around the summer solstice, which tends to be near the peak usually of sporadic E season. So if conditions are good, 6 meters can look a lot like HF during the June VHF contest. DXmaps.com, if you're not familiar with that, is a great place to watch the sporadic E MUF and to watch for openings to develop. It's also even more useful. 6 meters you can just listen to and hear activity, but it's also a good place to watch for 2 meter sporadic E openings, which are certainly not out of the question in the summertime. In fact, we had a very brief one. Which night was that? Last Friday night, actually lasted just a few minutes, but saw New York and New Jersey and North Alabama for just a couple of minutes on 2 meters. 6 meter meteor scatter is an effective strategy in the late night, very early morning hours. There's usually nothing else doing on the bands at that hour. It's rare to have a sporadic E opening that early in the morning, but that is the time to operate meteor scatter. Even though there's not necessarily a major meteor shower going on, there are rocks all the time, and you will definitely hear that on FT8 the entire contest when you hear those pings. The mewling cats, as I've heard them referred to, when the band is otherwise dead, when everybody is calling CQ, a lot of folks calling CQ at high power, you hear every rock that comes within 1,000 miles just about. So the meteors are there to take advantage of. You just have to be on to do it. Tropo is possible during June. You'll want to watch the Hepburn Tropo forecast in the days leading up to the contest. In fact, probably the first forecast for Saturday should be up now, Saturday afternoon. So I've provided the website for the Hepburn Tropo forecast there. That's a good resource to try to predict Tropo, but it's not the end-all, be-all of Tropo forecasts. There are times when it'll forecast a great opening and it doesn't happen, and there are times when it won't forecast an opening and one does happen. APRS propagation map, if you're not familiar with that on 2 meters, that's also a good tool for watching for primarily Tropo openings, but it's also useful for sporadic E. Best time for Tropo will be on Sunday morning hours, before the sun rises too far is prime time for Tropo. If you work somebody on 2 meters, if you operate 2 meters and you have any of the higher bands, be sure and ask them if they have any other bands, if they have 432 or 222, and run the bands with them. That you get more points for the higher bands. For 222 and 432, QSOs are worth double. They're worth 2 points. For 902 and 1296 are worth 3 points, and then the higher bands are worth 4. So it pays, if you have a lot of bands, to work everyone on as many bands as possible. So that is the end of the general portion. Whoops, let me go back. Let's see, back. There we go. Into the general portion of the presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail now about QRP portable and rover operations. By the way, one other quick note. I was just talking about QSO points. Does anybody know the difference in the rules between the ARRL June contest and the September contest and the January contest? There's one and only one difference. And that is QSO points are different in June. The contacts that are worth 3 points in June are worth 4 points in September and January, and the contacts that are worth 4 points in June are worth 8 points. Other than that, the rules for the 3 contests are identical. Okay, so single op QRP portable. Mentioned this category a little bit earlier. This was the category that really got me hooked on VHF contesting. The first VHF contest that I ever did, I did a limited multi-op with a guy here on the other end of the county from me, Steve Elrod, KU4IU. We did a limited multi-op in 2001 and 2002, and of course was fascinated with it then, and then college happened. So I was out of it for a few years, but in 2011, I'd bought a Yaesu FT817 about 3 years prior. And when I bought it with this category in mind. And in 2011, I finally decided to give it a go. The QRP portable category, the limitations are that the entire station must be portable, and that includes the power supply. You can't run off of commercial power. You have to have a generator, battery, solar, something that you can transport to the site. The antennas have to be transported too, so you can't drive over to somebody else's house and hook up to their antennas with a battery powered rig and say that you're QRP portable. The maximum output power is 10 watts, regardless of band or mode. And that's reflected in the fact that when you look at the line scores for this contest, the category for single op portable is Q. You may only operate from one location. It's not a rover category. You have to pick one location and operate the entire contest from that location. So there's no limitation on the number of bands or modes that you can operate, unlike some of the other categories. You are just limited to 10 watts and everything has to be portable. So a comparison of how single op portable used to be compared to how it could be now. So this was a picture of my station on Woodall Mountain in Mississippi, which is the highest point in Mississippi at a towering 846 feet. No, excuse me, 806 feet. It's even less. Used to operate regularly in the QRP portable category from up there. And it was a pile of gear. Had a Yaesu FT817 for 2 meters and 432, and also as an IF radio for 222. Had a little Ramsey amplifier to get the 2 meter side up to 10 watts, a THP UHF amp that almost got to 10 watts on 432. I think it did about 9. An old Yaesu FT690 R2, 10 watt 6 meter rig, and a Down East microwave transverter that was set up to do 10 watts max with 10 meter drive. And then had an interface box to generate the PTT signals for all of the amplifiers based on the band voltage on the 817, and a 20 amp SLA battery, and my power distribution box, and it was just a huge rat's nest. And obviously all analog in 2015. Now we have this. The ICOM 705, almost everything in one box except for the 222. I don't have a 705, but if I was still doing the QRP portable category, I would have a 705. So if you have a 705, it is ideal for this particular category. So look at antennas for portable. This is what I did. This was the from that same contest, 2015. I had homebrew Yagis for 2 meters, 222, and 432. The 222 and 432 I built myself using the WA5 VJB, designed 6 elements each. The 2 meter antenna was an old 4-element homebrew of unknown origin, and the 6 meter antenna was my old MFJ 3-element 6 meter beam that I have been using since 1998 and still use and will use this weekend. It may be one of the longest lived MFJ antennas in amateur radio history. So that's really about all I have to say about QRP Portable. And of course, I will take questions on it at the end if anyone has any. But there's not any real specific strategy to it. Just put up the best antennas that you can that are reasonably portable in your vehicle, and try to run the full 10 watts on as many bands as you can. The 3D, if you are running a barefoot 817, the 3dB really does make a difference in doing weak signal work. That said, I've made a lot of really good contacts at 5 watts. In fact, the first year that I did QRP portables, 2011, as I mentioned before, I had a barefoot FT817. My MFJ 6 meter antenna at that time had a broken element, so I was just using 2 elements on 6 meters. And I was using a stack of M² horizontal loops on 2 meters. 2 loops is all I had. And we had tremendous sporadic E that year. And this was all analog. This was all sideband and CW. Made 127 QSOs in 83 grids with 5 watts and 2 elements in that contest. So even though I say, use the best antennas and equipment that you have, use whatever you got, because you might be really surprised. And that score, that was an 11,000 point score that year. That's a competitive score in this category. Okay, so now to my favorite subject in VHF contesting, and that's roving. Let me take stuff. Quick sip there. All right, so the rover rules. So to be a rover, you must operate from more than one location. Now, historically, this meant you had to operate from more than one grid. That is no longer the case for ARRL contests, although that is still true for others. But the ARRL changed the rules, and now all you have to do is make contacts from more than one location, and a location is defined as a 500-meter circle. So as long as you move outside that 500-meter circle and make contacts, you qualify as a rover. Rovers must transport all radios, antennas, and power sources to each site. There's an exception. Rovers may have 2 operators. There's an exception. Rovers must sign /R on digital and CW and rover on phone. And it's really good operating practice if you're doing CW or phone and you're a rover to include your grid square in your CQ. CQ contest, November Victor 4 Bravo Rover Echo Mike 43. Reason being, anybody, not just fixed stations, but everyone can work you again when you move to a new grid square. It's not a dupe if you're giving out a different grid square. So if someone hears you call CQ and they've already worked you from one grid square, they won't know whether to call you again if you don't let them know that you have moved a different grid square. 100 QSOs max with one other individual rover station. Again, there's an exception to that. Limited rover, which is the category that I have been entering recently and plan to continue entering, uses the lowest 4 bands in a given contest, 6.2, 222, and 432. Again, compare that to limited multi-op. Those rules are different for limited multi-op. And the power limits are the same as those for single op low power. Classic rover does not have the power limit and does not have the band limitation. Classic rovers can use all the bands they want to. 10-band rovers are not uncommon. Unlimited rover doesn't just allow you to use any bands with no power limit. It also removes some of the other restrictions. You can have more than 2 operators. You can work other rovers as many times as you want. You can use fixed stations. You could actually rove from fixed station to fixed station or incorporate fixed stations into your rove somehow. I have an email out to ARRL headquarters now asking if it's permissible to do fixed station remote operation on an unlimited rove, and have yet to hear back on it. But that's a question that I have. I think that I don't think there's anything in the rules that prohibits that, but I just wanted to make sure. But Unlimited Rover is kind of intended, the VHF UHF activity committee really intended, it created that to be somewhat of an experimental category. So relatively few restrictions on Unlimited Rover, and it's actually not a terribly popular or competitive category, to be honest. Most folks tend to stick to the Limited Rover or Classic Rover categories. So the two terms that you hear when talking about rover operation, run and gun and stop and shoot. Run and gun is when you operate in motion with antennas mounted on your vehicle. Stop and shoot is where you go to a high spot and put up antennas temporarily, portable mast of some sort, and operate while fixed. Some rovers are exclusively one or the other. Some rovers do a mixture of both. I do mainly stop and shoot with run and gun in between. So here's a picture of the inside of my car. It's, as I mentioned before the meeting started, it's a 2016 Toyota Camry. I have an ICOM 7100 that stays in the car all the time. And for contests, that is my 6-meter radio. And then I put in the car using a desktop rack and a couple of shells. I have a ICOM 9700 for 2 meters and 432, and for contests that I'm not doing limited rover in, such as the 222 and up distance contest or the microwave sprint, also the 1296 radio. And then for 222, I have a Yaesu FT736, one of the two radios that does 222 all modes natively. The other is the ICOM 375A, and good luck finding one of those for a reasonable price. I don't have my tablet depicted here. Oh, you can also see down underneath the 7100, there's a Baofeng. That is for 222 FM. And that reminds me, I need to be sure and put that in the car this year. I know there's at least one station that I want to catch up with on 222 FM. So it pays to bring along 222 FM gear. There's some guys who only have FM on 222 and 902. My tablet is not pictured here. It's a Dell Latitude 5285. It's a Core i5 machine that the most important thing about it is that it powers off of USB-C. So I can power it from the car with DC. I don't have to have an inverter that tears up 6 meters. Works very well. It has really good performance. It's suitable for meteor scatter, for running a couple of instances of WSGT at once. It's a great machine for that. For this year, I'm going to be adding a few items. I have an amplifier for 222. It's actually a 120 watt amplifier, but I'll be setting it up for 100 watts to stay within the limited rover power limits. Also picked up a Rig Expert Plus at Dayton. It's a sound card interface, USB. It's a USB sound card, a WinKeyer, a CAT interface, an FSK interface, and a push-to-talk interface all in one box. And really pleased with the deal that I got on it. Got it wired up for the 736, and that will be much easier to use than the old sound card. Used to use a USB sound card, a USB serial adapter, and a level converter for not a level converter, an opto isolator for the push-to-talk, and transformers, the whole isolation interface for the sound card. Won't have to fool with that this year. It should be much more seamless and do PTT with CAT. Even though that radio has a really old and limited CAT implementation, it still works for that. Also picked up a tablet Saturday at the Atlanta Ham Fest. It was my first trip to Atlanta. Enjoyed that. And I also now have a mount for one of the tablets that goes behind the 7100, and that'll be much safer and slightly more legal this year as I operate in motion. The antenna setup for my stop and shoot. Well, actually, this depicts all of my antennas right here. So the mast is a decommissioned fiberglass hot stick, electrical lineman's hot stick that was decommissioned by a power company. They were given en masse to a guy who brings them every year to the Huntsville Hamfest, and you just have to know him. And one year I got really lucky. Somebody tipped me off, and I was able to pick some of them up. So that's what I use for a mast. The mount, which you can't really see in this particular picture, it's cut off at the bottom, is a drive-on flagpole mount. Bought off Amazon for about 25, 30 bucks. I took a couple of the bottom sections out of the hot stick, and it fits down not super snugly into the mount, but I do have to press in the button on the bottom section, and that holds it in place just enough. Sometimes if it's windy enough, I have to put a piece of tape around the first joint up about 4 or 5 feet up, and that keeps the mast from wandering even in windy conditions. The top antenna is a Diamond A144S10 10-element 2-meter Yagi, a very lightweight antenna. It's of course a compromise. It's a very short boom antenna for 10 elements, but like I say, it's compact. It's very, very lightweight, and it's been a very good performer for me. It does handle 100 watts, even though the specs say 50 at a 50% duty cycle. Neither I nor anyone else who I'm aware of who's used the antennas had a problem with it at 100 watts. Next on that mast is the MFJ Yagi, then the Directive Systems 15-element 432 Rover Yagi, and the 10-element 222 Rover Yagi. Those are 8-foot booms. They break down into 2 pieces that are 4 feet long each, and they lay right across the back seat of the car. Very convenient. Also have a 25-element loop Yagi for $12.96, which was not being used in this picture because this was September of last year. This was my Saturday operating location from Colbert Heights Mountain. In EM64 DQ, and that's looking to the east toward Huntsville. On top of the car, is a 6-meter quarter-wave whip, and on the back, on the trunk lip, is a short Hustler mobile mast. On top of that is an M-square HO loop for 222, and then the WT4E E-Factor dual band loop for 2 meters and 432. So as you can see, my setup is actually fairly simple. The in-motion setup is extremely simple. It is not the elaborate, 10-band rover like Key 2 EZs or W5 VYs or any of those. It may be one day, but it's not yet. Just a couple of quick notes. I'll hurry along because I know we're running long on time here. Choosing a location for portable and rover ops, it's something you really should put a little time into to find the good spots. Look for a place that has a clear view of the horizon. If you're lucky, there's Google Street View of certain spots, and people have taken pictures and uploaded them to Google, and you can see those. What you're looking for is height above average terrain, prominence, view of the horizon. A lot of hams really fixate on height above sea level, and that's really somewhat meaningless if you can't see the horizon. The ideal locations are prominent, public, and safe, and are something that you can get to in whatever you're driving. So sometimes those are challenging to find. It's always a good idea to put something on your vehicle that says amateur radio, because I have had more than one encounter with law enforcement. They've all ended very well, but it's just a good idea to make it known what you're doing if you're doing portable or rover work, especially if it's in an unusual location or a place where people don't usually, well, that's pretty much everywhere. People don't usually do this kind of thing, but you know what I mean. There are some online tools that you can use to help find good places. I'm not going to go through each of these, but there are tools for determining where grid lines are, where prominent places are, and this presentation I know will be made available to everyone, and you can look through those websites if you want at your leisure. A few notes about rover strategy, and this also doubles as lessons learned, and some of these lessons I haven't fully realized yet. Some of these strategies I'm not fully utilizing. But start out, do your homework, coordinate, find out who the fixed stations are going to be that are on, get in touch with them, get their cell phone numbers, or find out which chat rooms they're going to be on. Coordinate with other rovers. There are some strategies called grid circling and pack roving that certain rovers utilize. They are somewhat controversial, but they're legal, and they can be a big contributor to scores. This is opinion to me. In less populated areas, I found that stop and shoot is a better strategy than run and gun. If you have a really elaborate mobile setup with good gain antennas, you might do better. But I think you're better off taking the time to stop, set up, tear down, move to the next site, set up, operate, tear down, than you are to spend a lot of time on the roads. Good example of this is when I go to I've been to EM61 on some rows. The drive back home from EM61, I've come up through EM51, 52, 53, 54. Those grids are a long way from any activity centers. And when you're on compromised mobile antennas, it's difficult to make QSOs. However, if you are in motion and you hear a really, really good band opening, even if you're not quite to where you intended to go, sometimes it pays to just find a spot and pull over and set up and operate. Sometimes it's hard to deviate from the plan like that, but that can be profitable. I have missed out by pressing on to my destination during an opening, and when I got to the opening, I was only able to get in on the tail end of it. I would have actually done better to set up in a not so rare grid, work the opening, and not worry so much about making it to the rare grid. Speaking of rare grids, talked about being the wanted earlier. There are a few grid squares within driving distance that will make you somewhat popular. In Georgia, there's EM 71, 81, 82, and 91 that have relatively low activity compared to the other grids. That's not to say there's no activity from those grids, but there's less activity than there would be 70, 73, 74, 83, 84, certainly. In Alabama, EM 51, 52, 61, 62, and 71 are all fairly sparse in terms of activity. So those are opportunities for those who are interested in giving roving a try. Good locations near population centers, though, are hard to beat too. As I mentioned, operated from Chattanooga in the 2-meter sprint in the spring, and that worked really well from the mountaintops there. You do get a multiplier. It counts as a grid multiplier for each grid that you make a contact from as a rover in the ARRL contest. That's really not a good enough incentive, especially if there's propagation, because you could pick up that one multiplier from someone else rather than spending an hour on the road to get to a different grid square. So I would not use that bonus multiplier as a driver to activate as many grids as possible. I've done 2 or 3 10 grid activations, and those went fairly well, but there was a lot of downtime. That's driving up through the EM50s again was slow, especially in September and January. CQ VHF is different because your multipliers reset. When you go to a different grid, you can work all the multipliers over again. So that changes the strategy a little bit. Final word, there is no substitute for BIC time. I think everyone knows what BIC time is, and if you don't, it's butt in chair. That's one thing that's not different from HF contests. There's no substitute for seat time, and regardless of which category you operate. The secret to how I won the September VHF contest as a limited rover is simply I was in the right places at the right times. I was in EM 55. I was roving around the local grid corner over here, EM 54, 55, 65, 64, and caught a tropo opening that developed all sort of out of the blue Saturday night of the September contest to Texas. Worked several stations in Texas that I wouldn't have operated had I not been on, or I wouldn't have contacted had I not been operating. And then Sunday morning, the tropo opening was back. So and sporadic E openings are even more fleeting than that. So it's all about being on at the right times. You know, sometimes that means struggling through hours where you may not make 10 QSOs. You just got to stick with it. So that's kind of the conclusion as far as strategy goes, and just a really super quick word about what I've been able to do with the setups that I've depicted. This is not, I'm not saying this to brag. This is very much a, if I can do it, you can do it. I certainly, there's nothing elaborate about what I've done. I think it's within the reach of just about anybody, both financially and technically. QRP portable hilltopper, or QRP portable categories. It's called QRP hilltopper in CQ VHF. Best finish was second overall in January of 2016, first overall in June of 2016, fifth overall in the 2016 CQ VHF contest, and my best September finish. And in fact, I think my only entry in the September contest in the portable category was in 2019 when I finished fifth. And then for Rover, finished sixth overall in January of 2021, had grandiose plans for this year, had what I thought was a great route laid out, was really looking forward to it, and it snowed. So I finished 20th in the claimed scores this year. I only operated about 3 or 4 hours Saturday afternoon and called it quits. So still looking for a better finish in the January VHF contest. I was third overall last year in June. Fourth overall in CQ VHF in 2020. Propagation was very poor last year in CQ VHF. And then, of course, won the September VHF contest last year for Limited Rover and set a new Delta division record, 47,864 points. And actually, you may have noticed, it said division record on the 2016 single op, June VHF single op portable. That is actually a mistake because the database does not include results prior to about 1999. There was actually I think a 19,000 point score turned in from Alabama in, I believe it was 1991. I think Ham operated from Mount Cheaha in EM 73 and did very well. So that was not actually a division record, but the Limited Rover in last September was. So that is all that I have.